Welcome to panel 2 of the Truth and Transformation Convening, sponsored by the Institutional Antiracism and Accountability Project, IARA, at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. I am Carrie Ratcliffe, a research fellow here at IARA. Our second panel of the day is Rewriting the Rulebook, Reporting and Regulating for Organizational Accountability. In this panel, we will examine how tools of accountability are advancing within the private sector. And we will also explore the impact of government, both from a regulatory and legal perspective on transparency and accountability. We have 3 panelists, each of whom will bring their distinct perspective into our conversation, focusing on equity within the broader context of ESG, or environmental, social, and governance frameworks within private institutions, with a closer focus on examples of what actually works at a very granular level through examples. I'd like to welcome first Dawn James. Dawn is a managing director at Deloitte, where she leads ESG and sustainability strategy and transformation within Deloitte's strategy and analytics practice. Dawn leads a wide range of initiatives in energy transition, sustainability, digital cloud solutions, and innovation. Dawn has over 25 years of industry program management experience as a geoscientist and systems leader. She's a certified naturalist. Yay, I really love that aspect. And a hydrologist, and was formerly with Microsoft and the U.S. Department of Interior. Welcome, Dawn.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Damien Dwin is also with us today. Damien is the founder and chief executive officer of Lafayette Square. Previously, Damien served as co-founder and co-CEO of Brightwood Capital Advisors, and prior to that had served his time, maybe I should say, at Credit Suisse and Goldman Sachs. Damien launched Lafayette Square in January 2021 as an impact investment firm focused on economic growth, investments across the United States through the creation and preservation of working-class jobs. Damien is an active thought leader on place-based investing. We'll hear more about that today, I'm sure. Mass incarceration and the use of capitalism for good. He has written for the Financial Times, Entrepreneur, and Inc.com. Damien also currently serves as chair of the board of trustees for Vera Institute of Justice. Welcome, Damien.
Thank you.
And last but far from least, we're welcoming Veronica Root Martinez. She's a professor of law at Duke University. She's an expert in professional and organizational ethics. In her writing, teaching, and research, she draws on scholarship from the areas of ethics, compliance, corporate and securities law, workplace law, equity, and inclusion. Her research and teaching expertise is on corporate compliance, and she's a leading academic expert on the role of monitors and monitorships. She's published or has work forthcoming in numerous leading law journals. Her book, Building an Effective Ethics and Compliance Program, is forthcoming with Edward Elgar. And additionally, she's co-author of the 5th edition of a case book on securities litigation, enforcement, and compliance. Outside of Duke, she currently serves on the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, better known as FINRA, National Adjudicatory Council. Welcome, Veronica.
I can't say it either. Thank you so much for having me and for facilitating the conversation today.
Let's dive in. We're focusing here on the context of equity and anti-racism within the private sector, and how that shows up within a context of ESG and regulation. As Khalil alluded to earlier, corporate governance is under a heat lamp, so to speak, of politicized debate and legal challenges. And our panelists will help us to understand how the values of equity, anti-racism, and social justice can continue to be implemented in the private sector, despite pushback, obstacles, and challenges. I'll ask each of the panelists a question, followed up by inviting the other panelists to comment or add in any other perspectives. Towards the end of the session, we'll find some questions from our viewers, and we'll field some questions from our viewers, and finally ask each panelist for their key takeaways. As a reminder, right after this session, in the same Zoom link, we will feature a live artistic interpretation of the Truth and Transformation Convening, and I'll tell you more about that at the end of our panel. Let's dive in. Dawn, I'd like to start by asking you a question. Your particular expertise is within the energy sector, and specifically energy equity. You have said sustainability includes climate and equity as inseparable forces. Broadly speaking, why does accountability and transparency in the sector matter for racial equity and energy equity? And if possible, please give us a specific example of how public transparency on a particular metric can serve both the firm and the public.
Yeah, well, so first of all, thank you again for having me on your panel and all of my esteemed panelists. I'm really happy to talk about this topic. I've dedicated my career to it, and I think, just like you mentioned in the question, that these things are intrinsically linked. When we're talking about sustainability, what that means, that's a very broad umbrella topic. It means different things to different people. However, it does have an actual definition, and how we implement it across an organization that includes many different complex moving parts, right, is very important, and it must be done with intention, and also with all of the different stakeholders in mind, right? So when we look at that wheel of stakeholders, obviously the corporation or the entity, the firm, is very important in that. What makes up the firm, which is the people, the workers, the employees, whether they're knowledge-based employees, whether they're frontline workers. Also, all the partners are involved, all of the vendors, the supply chain vendors, all those things are, all those people, all those entities are involved when we start talking about scope 1, scope 2, and especially scope 3 emissions. Also, we look at those broader concentric circles that go out from an organization. So the community that they serve. And again, I'm going to put on different hats here. One of my personal hats is that the purpose of a corporation is to serve the community, right? Whether it's through products and services, whether it's through a certain kind of brand that they put out there, it's all to serve the community in which they are involved in, right? And so all of these things impact each other. And if we look at it from a corporate perspective and as an organization, the reason why accountability and transparency are important is one, so that they understand their own growth metrics. So they understand, from a benchmarking perspective, where they started from, where they're trying to get to, and how well they've made it, how far they've made it in achieving those goals. And so the reason why I say these things, as far as energy equity and the transformation that we're seeing in the energy sector are intrinsically linked, is because the energy transition won't be successful if it doesn't include everyone. And I make this point a lot, usually when I'm talking to my daughters and trying to explain what it is that I do. It's very simple and it's complex at the same time, right? If we don't have clean air to breathe, then we don't have clean air to breathe. Nobody has clean air to breathe, right? These are all shared resources. If we don't have clean water to drink, then we all don't have clean water to drink, right? So that doesn't matter how much money you have, what side of town you live on, all of these things are shared resources. So we all have skin in the game, right? So from an accountability and transparency standpoint, what we don't want to have happen, and this is something that I personally have worked with in the many organizations that I serve, is that we don't want empty promises, right? There's a lot of reasons why an organization might make a statement around their initiatives, their goals, and what we want as the community that those organizations serve, also the employees that work within that organization, also for the executives who are driving the vision. We don't want those to be empty promises. So we want internally to have accountability so that we're making sure that we are marking those growth metrics in a reliable way and a transparent way, so that that organization knows what its own organization is doing in-house, right? So we know what we're doing. And then we also want that transparency externally, because again, these organizations are meant to serve the community. So whether that's their customer base or whether they are people that are seeking some type of service or employment, or they're part of the partnership concentric rings around that organization, it's important that they know what those growth metrics look like also. And then also what we want to look at is how to have that bias towards action. How do we drive that action improvement in a way that's going to make tangible change to the better, right? So essentially, there's a number of different metrics, and this is where I talk about the digital underpinning or the digital foundation to being able to have an equitable energy transition, right? So one of the things I like to talk about, like you mentioned in your intro, I'm a scientist. I'm all about the data, right? Data doesn't lie. Data will give you a very firm understanding of where you started from, where you're trying to get to, and how well you're doing along the way to getting to those goals. So having some type of tracking, tracing, monitoring, reporting that is able to set those benchmarks to drive a particular type of behavior, right? And again, I'm speaking internally and externally, driving that behavior internally, because it's very important within an organization that everybody's pointed in the same direction, working on the same goals. If I were to ask a person in the front line, what are your sustainability goals and objectives? They should be able to articulate it at the same way as a CEO, right? The whole organization should be aligned with where they're moving. And you can't have that alignment if you don't have transparency internally. And then, of course, externally, that's important too, because we certainly have the court of public opinion. And that also drives the behaviors of corporations. So all of these things are intrinsically linked. And I guess the point that I'll end on is that all of these things, if we talk from people, planet, and profits, right? Those are the 3 Ps that we kind of like to talk about. We have to focus on the people, without which we don't exist, right? And for a corporation to do well, the planet has to do well, right? So those 2 things are very important for prioritization. And then when you do those things in a way that's accountable and transparent, then you can start looking at how that impacts your profits.
Great, thank you. Damien or Veronica, do you have a response to that, or maybe an example where you see a particular metric achieving the aims that Dawn has done such a great job of laying out?
So I can jump in.
Great.
So let's think about within a workforce, an organization's management, the individuals who are in the level of managers within an organization. So on the accountability piece, we might need the sorts of targeted metrics that Donna is talking about to know what the baseline is at a firm. So I need to measure how many, let's say, Black managers I have within my organization. And I need to know that so that I can figure out whether or not I'm happy with where I'm at, or if I need to set some goals and aspirations about adjusting the percentage of managers I have that are Black. And so I can't do that if I don't have my baseline. So you have to come in and come up and figure out what your baseline is. And then you need to set some goals about what you want your organization to achieve. And by doing that, we can answer questions like, what percentage of our management ranks within the firm are Black? How do we know whether or not we've created a system where Black managers are being excluded? How do we know if we need to make adjustments to our hiring or retention practices? How do we know if we need to, maybe we're great at hiring, it turns out when we do our assessment, but maybe we need to adjust what our retention efforts, and then the broader question is, how would we even know whether or not our organizational structure reflects the values of our organization? Most organizations have stated values, but the question is, are we living our values? And we won't know the answer to that if we don't ask a series of questions. On the transparency piece, if we're not doing something well, we don't normally kind of flout it. We don't put it out there for everyone to see. And firms can be similar to that. So if firms aren't having to disclose information, for example, about their demographic diversity, if they're not doing well, it would be easier for them to hide it. And one of the problems with hiding things is sometimes we stick our head in the sand. And so it's really important for there to be accountability within the firm in terms of identifying what our goals are and assessing whether or not we're meeting them, but also to do that in a transparent way, because that actually increases the accountability of us attempting to achieve our goals.
Thanks for that. Damien, anything to add on that?
I'll just give an example. We have 2030 goals at our firm. We are SEC registered and regulated by both the SEC and the Small Business Administration. We've committed by 2030 to produce 100,000 working class jobs, which we measure based on low, moderate income status. We've committed that 50% of our investments will be outside of high income areas, which again, we use the LMI definition. So, we're place-based in that way. And then the third goal, of course, is 50% of our portfolio companies will adopt some form of managerial assistance where we directly, explicitly improve the employee benefits of the workers in our portfolio companies. The concept behind being worker-centric, as we are with these three goals, producing jobs that pay a living wage, looking at the communities where those jobs are created, and focusing on benefits, is rooted in our capitalist motivation to make money and do so with attractive risk-adjusted returns. We think we have a better chance of getting our money back if workers are paid appropriately and have the necessary benefits to do their job. And we think there's something efficient about making those goals public and committing in SEC filings to move in this way. We're an investment manager. We've got 55 people in 18 states. We're targeting middle market companies that are growing, audited, cash flowing businesses, usually doing tens of millions of dollars of cash flow, sometimes as much as $100 million of cash flow, usually owned by families. And we're lending them money because banks don't lend the way they used to. We've seen a couple of banks fail this year, and we know most of the private credit industry is focused on private equity controlled businesses. So I think these examples matter because, interestingly, they make you more attractive, not less. And in our case, I believe they actually result in us getting lower cost capital, longer duration capital, because we have data attached to our goals. And frankly, what I described is the superficial level. We can drill deeper beyond the big three and then really get into the specifics of what we're seeing with employee benefits and how we track and measure our performance there. But as both panelists have said, baselining is critical. And we've done that, and I think it's been a part of what makes us interesting to investors.
That's great. Maybe I can pose the next question to you to kind of dig a little deeper into what you've said. You have said in the past, how do we drive change in low and moderate income areas? How do we actually measurably help people who are so often under the boot of the system? You've given us a couple of examples there. Your firm, you had told me, was basically purpose-built for this work and varies quite greatly from other organizations that you've worked for, which weren't necessarily, and Dawn has mentioned the same thing about how do you retrofit some of these values or purpose to an institution that's been living a long time, and there might be other obstacles for that. But you had a blank sheet of paper. Can you describe a little bit about how you know that you're achieving what you set out to do? And how do you collect and analyze racial and social impact data and turn it into useful information that not only you as a leader can use, but those within your firm can use on a daily basis, like Veronica said, in terms of, and Dawn said, in terms of making it a company-wide measurable and a goal at the same time?
Sure. So look, with optimism, I can point out some obvious elements. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And here's why. 50% of investments today go to just 5 states. Think about that. We're in a 50-state country and half the money goes to just 5 states. So you can make a lot of money by just thinking about the other 45 states where there's a supply-demand imbalance and for doing work that other people don't want to do outside of New York, California, Texas, Florida, and based on the year, Illinois or Massachusetts. So the first step from our perspective was to be geographically diversified, to be place-based. The second is, in the context of place, zip codes matter. We have data showing that 80% of investment goes to high income zip codes. So even within a big state like New York or a big state like California, the precise zip code matters, both for where the business is headquartered, but just as importantly, where the employees live. And so that sets up the next big point. We started our company with a bent toward data science. We have a chief technology officer who we hired from industry. He ran data science for a very large global bank. We have a data lake, and we're really clinical about interrogating where do people live and what are the social economic indicators of that place before we even have a conversation with them about their personal situation. We can discern based on the data science, cost of living, student loan debt, medical debt, home ownership rates, FICO scores, incarceration rates. The list goes on. So with this knowledge, in addition to knowledge about the wages of an employee, all this can be, by the way, ascertained, very light touch. It's like arthroscopic surgery. You don't need a big incision to pierce the veil and understand this fundamental data about a business and its employees. Once you have that context, both about the headquarters of the business, the actual socioeconomic situation for the workers, then you're in a position to make specific recommendations that are informed by facts. The final layer, of course, is with humility, just ask people, what do you need? It's one thing to say, here's $100 million for your company. It's something else to say, I'd like to survey your 300 employees and ask them within their benefits program, what are they missing? And it's funny. If you went to the Department of Commerce, Commerce would tell you their polling indicates, and this is an astonishing stat, if you are making less than 80% of area median income working at a company, your probability of enrolling in the company's health and retirement benefits is like 30%. So companies offer benefits that working class people don't use because the benefits are too expensive. Meanwhile, the highest earners at the company are using those benefits 70+% of the time. And this is just based on commerce data. If you talk to individual middle market companies about what's happening, you get this fresh information. So the combination of polling, using public data sets, private data sets, now you can make recommendations. And in my experience, money is a great inducement. It's one thing to say to somebody, do the right thing. Something else to say, I'm going to give you an incentive to do the right thing, like lower your cost of capital. And this is what we do at Lafayette Square. We actually reduce the interest rate on the loans we make to companies that embrace this line of thinking and do right by their workers. And we don't do it because we're feel-good people. We do it because it improves our chances of being repaid on the investments we make. And it also happens to be moral and ethical and the right thing to do for capitalism and the whole society.
I think, Damien, I don't know if you can still hear us, but we can't hear you at this moment.
I'm here. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Maybe
okay.
it was kind of a mic drop.
Missed that last.
Did it.
We missed your mic drop if you had one there.
No.
I'd love to double click on
Please.
something that Damien said that really kind of resonated with some of the work that I do. You mentioned, as you were kind of stating some of the statistics, but being informed by the facts. And I'll add to that, being informed by the facts to drive tangible action. And I think that's like to the same point of what you were saying. And leveraging those internal polls, leveraging that polling with your stakeholders, that's really important. And I agree. One of the things when I'm working with a number of different organizations on pulling together their strategic initiatives and understanding their vision, it has to make business sense. Right. It has to, when I mention people, planet, and profit, there has to be a business case for that. Right. Because this is the society that we live in. And we're also looking at these companies at having some type of growth, and they have their own accountability metrics, business accountability metrics, and that's not changing. And so when we talk about energy equity or equity within this process, When I talk about it, it's very much about the business pluses and minuses and how you look at it. And, I think we have a question in the chat that asked about how do we influence, some of these executives. And the biggest way is, to Damien's point, is generating value for the shareholders. How do we look at powering the lives internally and externally of the people that come in contact with that corporation, right? And that leads directly to brand and reputation, right? Being able to enhance trust within that organization to local communities and being able to incorporate those voices into the design of the function that you're actually doing. So whether you're producing some type of product or services, having input into the design from the voices of the people that buy it has immeasurable impact to the success of your business, right? And on top of that is talent, how you attract, retain those top talents. That is a huge issue right now. In the energy sector, we talk about the great retirement of the boomers, right? It's a big kind of knowledge transfer that has to happen. The great crew change is what they call it, right? It is upon us. We are here, right? I'm Gen X and we are now the executives. Our parents are all retired. That great crew change has given an opportunity for younger generations to choose which industry, which corporations that they want to go into. And so being able to attract top talent means, what does your corporation stand for? And so if you don't have a fact-based, data-informed answer, then that talent will go elsewhere. Right. And that is a business case. Same with having access to capital. I think Damien mentioned that as well, right? To be a successful business, you must have and be able to increase your access to capital, and being able to being able to set and then achieve those targets looks very good for showing that you run a successful business, right? So all of those things play a huge role in being able to set a fact-based business case, and then also being able to align that strategy with being able to achieve those metrics.
Thanks, Dawn. Veronica, I would like to have your response to that, but also maybe give a little context to the next question, which is, you're kind of an expert in both government and the legal field, which in essence is meant to give more oversight to larger social goals than just the business case. Both Damien and Dawn have talked about how social goals get built in within the business case, but you're an expert on really how does community and society oversee it, and what do you see as examples of how we're ensuring that organizations prioritize some of these larger social goals, including racial equity in their work.
Sure. So I'll start off by kind of following on from what Damien and Dawn were saying. When we think about understanding what organizations need, one thing you might employ is something like a compliance survey, or in the DEI space, a cultural survey. So sometimes we make assumptions about what somebody might need. We might assume that they want $1 million in capital, but it might actually be more effective to find out, what do the employees think that they need over the long term of the organization. And that can be extremely important when you're thinking about creating a culture that is going to be in alignment with your values, because if you aren't checking in with your employees to figure out whether or not they think the organization's aligned with the stated values, you won't actually know. On the business case piece, I think it's important to make the business case for DEI. I think it's important to explain why this would be beneficial to the bottom line of the organization. There is some empirical evidence that suggests the legal case is also important. So embracing an anti-discrimination framework within your organization when creating your DEI efforts, that might even be more effective at resulting in retention of demographic groups. My own view, though, is that neither of those is going to be sufficient if you aren't incorporating ethics within both of those frameworks. So explaining to your workforce, this is not just about money. This is about money plus how are we going to be acting ethically? Like how are we using our money and our values together to ensure that we are making profit for our firm in an ethical way? And that's important for not doing things like treating employees as fungible assets, like thinking, oh, well, we want to increase the demographic diversity of our firm and we need to have a woman on every committee, but we only have one woman, but so we'll just put her on all the committees, without thinking about how that might actually deter or make it harder for that woman to do her job, right? So it's really important to think about the business case and the legal case through the framing of ethics as well. On the regulatory side, we have seen formal regulatory interventions as well as what I'm going to call quasi-regulatory from self-regulatory organizations, interventions in an effort to create strong incentives for organizations to improve their DEI efforts. The most probably the most famous or well-known are the California law that was passed to require certain demographic diversity within boards of directors. We have another example with the NASDAQ rule that was proposed in a similar way. The benefits of that sort of regulatory intervention are that it is clear, it is specific, and we know what we're supposed to be doing and disclosing. The drawbacks to something like that might be, we might be concerned about tokenism. I've seen some studies that suggest one of the effects of requiring certain demographic slates of board of directors is that you don't end up with more people of color and women on board of directors. The people who are already doing it end up on more boards. And so then you have concerns about whether or not they're overboarded. And are the rules really encouraging boards of directors to move beyond their traditional networks and thinking through who are additional individuals who might be qualified for these boards outside of our in-group? And that's important because you actually want people in the out group to help the board do its job more efficiently. There have been other regulatory, in addition to kind of the broad-based calls for there to be certain demographics on board of directors, the SEC a couple of years ago passed something called a human capital disclosure. And that actually, I was wondering how it would work because it wasn't particularly specific. And the SEC has passed things in the past, has adopted regulations in the past that weren't specific, and the organizations ended up technically complying, but not complying with the intent of the rule. So the SEC had a diversity board disclosure rule where then boards were responding about why they thought their boards were diverse, but they weren't actually doing anything on the demographic side, which had been the intent of the rule. For the human capital management disclosures, they've actually been much more successful, I think, than the text of the regulation itself would have necessitated. So the way that organizations have responded to that disclosure requirement has been relatively expansive. And that's really promising because if you have a bunch of folks in industry responding in a particular way, you're creating an industry standard. So even if the regulation itself isn't super specific, if the response to the regulation is trending in a particular way, then that's going to become the expectation of what you're supposed to do when engaging in that regulation. Another, I'll just say, potential intervention that has not been used, that people have asked quite a bit about being used, is there are EEO-1 disclosures that corporations have to give to the EEOC. So an EEO-1 disclosure for firms with more than 100 employees, they are required to give their demographic diversity of their workforces to the EEOC. But the law also prevents the EEOC from disclosing this publicly. So scholars and advocates have for years asked for this to be appended, to basically require the disclosure, but allow it to be publicly transparent. And really that would be quite transformative. Firms would not be able to hide whether or not they are or are not good at demographic diversity within their organizational structures. It would, the disclosure of that sort of information, I think would just be a really interesting intervention to see happen, but that has not happened to date.
Thank you. That kind of leads into what I wanted to ask all of you guys as our next question is you talked about sort of standardization of a standard or a metric or a framework. And we've seen a lot of groups kind of trying in the environmental field that's been much more successful in terms of disclosure and what you're being asked to be transparent and accountable to the outside public. Have you seen any cooperative efforts at metric building and reporting that seem successful to you as in the realm of racial equity? We know that policy like Just Capital, Impact Alpha are all working in this space. And can any examples, perhaps Dawn, you can comment on this, from cooperative, environmentally focused efforts be instructive? How do you see or don't see different sectors coalescing around useful metrics and or disclosure, public disclosure?
Yeah, so I think the easier way to answer the question for me is because I'm focused on ESG and sustainability within the corporate space. So many of the metrics are being driven from a regulatory standpoint, right? So in the energy sector, energy is one of the most regulated sectors and hard to abate sectors. So it's not new, right? So, for the 25 plus years that I've been in environmental science, there's always been some very, very stringent regulations that have to be abided by. I started out my career in infrastructure in the AEC sector, and to be able to put anything into the ground, there's a number of permits and things that you have to go through. So from an environmental standpoint, there are many regulations that are already in place that require a certain level of reporting. And so what we're looking at now is how that's changing, given the fact that we are in a climate crisis. Right. So who's impacting the climate crisis the most from a people standpoint within this era? And I'm talking about geologic time. And then, what are the best methods to mitigate that, and who is going to be held responsible and accountable for that? And then how do we track and trace that? And so from that standpoint, we're seeing a lot of changes happening, SEC regulations that are changing, and also some of the environmental regulations from the EPA are changing, and so that is dictating dictating a response from organizations that sit in those sectors that are being impacted, and then that also the concentric circles that I was talking about before, that impacts those midstreams, those vendors, right? That will impact that company's third or scope 3 emissions, right? So supply chain is a huge issue. And I really like what Veronica was talking about as well, because I tend to lock arms with our legal department because it's really important to understand the paper, I guess that's the legal paper that that kind of is the foundation for those regulations, and also understanding how to comply with them in the right way. So, and to your point, Veronica, it was very, I'm not going to say it was very lawyerly of you, but it really resonated with me when you mentioned ethics as underpinning the business and the legal arguments, because that's something that I don't hear a whole lot unless we're talking about risk mitigation, right? Risk and how ethics play a role in that. So when you said that, I'm like, wait a second, you're very, very right about that, right? So when we start talking about this business case and putting together how companies are going to essentially be ready for the regulations as they come down the pike, we have to infuse, just like Veronica said, ethics into that business case and how we're going to properly address it, because it's not just the regulators that we're appeasing, but our internal and external stakeholders that also have skin in the games for how we answer these questions.
Let me spice it up and add some.
I could see you were chomping at the bit to
the
throw in something spicy here. Thank you.
I have to build a big tent. I have to build a big tent. In order for me to make money and do business, I got to figure out how to have Elizabeth Warren and Ron DeSantis at the same table for Thanksgiving, passing the stuffing and smiling at each other. Are you drinking white or red tonight?
Can I be in the room when you do that? Just listening in.
Right. So the only way I can make a big tent is to make this about place, not race. This will frustrate some of my friends to the left. But I'm a Black man running an investment management business. I center place. Investors and people who borrow money from me can come to their own conclusions about my politics to the extent they care. But if I'm driving capital outside of high income places, a lot of people benefit. And I just point out, we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. Designing these disclosures and creating a spirit of big tent intention is the way to go. Particularly when money is on the table and you're in a recessionary environment with inflation, record low unemployment, and the Fed has moved 500 basis points and good companies have to pay 10, 11% to borrow money. Got to build a big tent and leave the impression that all Americans, particularly Americans outside of Beverly Hills and Midtown Manhattan, win. And so that for me has been the focus and is very much part of the industrial design of our goals and our disclosure around those goals.
Okay, great. It kind of leads us right into sort of asking perhaps Veronica and Dawn explicitly whether what we're seeing in terms of political and cultural pushback that Khalil alluded to in his opening remarks has impacted the work in the environment that you're observing. And if so, perhaps I could say that Damien has described working a high wire act to get the work done with, if I can paraphrase, still achieve social and racial equity goals and yet bring people along in agreeing on certain metrics and or measures that everyone can agree on. I don't know if that's fair, Damien, but that's how I heard that. So Dawn and Veronica, maybe you can speak to kind of current events and how you see it impacting either your work or your advisees' work.
So sure, I'm going to start with a little story. So I had a student contact me once who was really concerned about DEI within a student organization and was upset that the student was experiencing a range of roadblocks. And my response to the student was, they don't care about diversity, so you have to figure out an argument that they care about. And the student didn't like my response, but it was relatively easy to find an argument that they cared about that would have the effect of increasing the demographic diversity of the organization. One of the things I said to him, I was like, well, you should have your organization go do some benchmarking with your reputational peers, because I can tell that what y'all are doing is not in line with your reputational peers, and no one wants to not do that. No one wants to be in that situation. And corporations do not, when they're benchmarking, want to be outside of what their reputational peers are doing, in part because it can create liability. So the organizational sentencing guidelines say that you need to comply with, that you can get in trouble if you don't comply with the law. They also talk about industry practice, which means that you could get in trouble for not adhering to industry practice and standards. The organizational guidelines also say that you're supposed to adhere to your own internal norms and policies. And we have seen organizations sanctioned for failing to follow their own norms and policies. A good example of that happened with the OCC and the Fed in the mortgage foreclosure crisis. So I think that an organization that is committed to DEI work and to really moving the needle on racial equity has to have a multi-prong approach. And that multi-prong approach, I do think, has to be rooted in finding and articulating what are our values with regards to DEI. But in addition to that, how are we going to get there? And some of the strategies for getting there need to look race neutral. Part of how you get to where you want to go, that helps you build what Damien is calling that big tent. And I think that is particularly important right now, given the politicization of and the backlash for certain efforts like ESG and different sorts of interventions. I actually was teaching, I taught a contracts class yesterday, and I was talking to them about the rise of the law and economics movement, and then the rise of the critical legal theory movement, and that was and then how CRT started. And then I said to them, you know, CRT is a complicated legal theory from law schools. Do you really think kindergarten teachers are teaching it? Right? They're not. We've weaponized things that we don't fully understand. And some of those fights need to happen. And some people do need to engage in direct fights against what is just improper information being given to the populace. But in addition to that, we have to think expansively about what sort of strategies are going to allow us to achieve the goals that we need to get to. And sometimes those strategies need to be race neutral. And race neutral strategies can allow your organization to meet its values with regards to its DEI hopes and dreams.
Dawn, before you respond, I'm going to bring in some of the audience questions at this point, as we're getting close to, unfortunately, running out of time. I think we could talk about this for many hours, if not days. One of our audience members has posed right on point from Veronica. How has the SCOTUS ruling on affirmative action in higher education impacted your efforts to advance racial equity within your institutions?
So, you know, the work that I do is focused on ESG, sustainability, and strategy. And as underpinning that, I focus on energy equity. And I think, you know, I really liked what Veronica was saying, because I run into this quite a bit in my line of work. There's a lot of ways that DEI and equity benefit an organization that is not race specific. And that is not the only thing that fits under DEI, right? And I think that, so I'll take this in two parts. One, the SCOTUS ruling recently and how that's affected my day-to-day. And that answer is easy. It hasn't, right? Because the organizations that I work with and that I work for, to Veronica's point, have cultural guidelines, have internal norms, they have a code of business conduct, and they have a way of operating that's necessary for them to continue to operate within a particular type of legal guideline. And that's has not gone away, right? And the other part of it is the business case, right? And I'll kind of keep going back to that because that is actually what moves the needle in the argument, right? And it is very well known that diverse groups have better results. Diverse boards give better results to companies. Having a larger tent increases your market share, right? Having products that don't serve the entire community lowers your ability to sell those products, right? And that's accessibility. That's geopolitical, where you're living, and making sure that it makes sense for, those products make sense for where you're trying to sell them geographically. There's a lot of things that come under that umbrella. And so it doesn't make business sense to disregard the DEI initiatives and how far we've come, right? Which is one of the reasons why, for myself and my day-to-day in the company, the firm that I work for, and also in the firms that I serve, I have not seen rapid shifts, right? Because it's not good for business, right? So that's kind of like the main point I think that I would say on that. And then the other point is, like I was saying, there's a big umbrella when we say DEI. There's a big umbrella when I talk about energy equity. And when I have those conversations, especially in companies that are maybe a bit more conservative, I work in a full range of companies. But we talk about optimizing operations. We talk about efficiency. We talk about, like I said, market share. We talk about reach of products. And also, to Veronica's points, we talk about being able to win the hearts and minds of teams internally, right? And all of those things require, and this is a part of business that I think is very foundational. It's change management, right? All of these things, when we're looking at benchmarking, tracking and tracing, monitoring, and then being able to gather insights from those things to have better insight to the growth and strategy of our corporations, it requires us to have that big tent thinking, to Damien's point, right? And so it requires us to have an understanding of how change management works and an understanding of how to be inclusive so that that messaging will reach everyone. And like I said before, so that everyone is on the same page.
I think all of you have talked a lot about, how you frame the narrative, right? Both internally and externally. We've had a couple questions from the audience, and I'll ask you guys to consider this, giving a specific example of how you've seen stakeholders, community members, advocates actually help to influence a corporation, your corporation or others, kind of from the outside, whether that was in reaching out the way Damien has described or in kind of stakeholder activism. Can you give me a specific example of where you've seen community stakeholders influence a corporate accountability and transparency issue? And then we have just a few minutes left to give us a few key takeaways as concrete advice for folks working both within corporate institutions and outside of the institutions that are hoping to move the work towards greater racial equity. Damien, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, and I'm going to go hard and fast.
Okay, great.
We named our business Lafayette Square after the park in Washington, D.C. So we are signaling to D.C., specifically regulators, we are native. And we're looking to align with the spirit and intent of regulation. Within the last 18 months, the Biden administration has gotten Congress to appropriate more money than we've seen in the history of mankind as part of the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, and obviously what we're doing with all things related to green gas reduction. And so here you have EPA, SBA, Commerce spending more money than ever. But when you read the fine print of that legislation, and this is because of Joe Manchin and Sinema, it is explicitly clear there is economic bias toward things that create money in low, moderate income places, job training for low, moderate income people. It's embedded in the legislation. It's codified. That money has not hit the street yet. The way this works, and although we may have a government shutdown next week, the way this works, the money's really going to show up next year, ironically, in an election year. And you'll feel that money from an inflationary perspective in 24, 25, even out to 26. But I just want to point out, Black people benefit from job training. Black people benefit from money going to low, moderate income places. More white people will benefit. And I'll say to you, in a conversation about race, that is okay. But the legislation was designed to try to stimulate economic activity in a way that its architects needed to get Republican and Democratic support to make those dollars flow. And these are new dollars. These are inflationary stimulants. The way I think about this, you got to be able to explain in a very simple, all shucks kind of way how you make money. And I'm able to make money because I find good assets that generate a premium return, but I also have access to the government to borrow money that I can relend. And I get access to more money to borrow because of low, moderate income places and job training. This managerial assistance thing is a big deal. I think we should be bear hugging these concepts of geography and workforce training, managerial assistance, because they are very, very good, very foundational elements for all races, but particularly Black and brown people.
Thanks. Veronica.
So let me think about a little bit about your question directly. So I'm very particular because I'm a law professor. So you said community stakeholders, and I can't answer that way, but I can answer with employee stakeholders. And when we look at the Disney case, the firm was not going to issue any statements with regard to the policies in Florida. And then they were pushed really hard by a set of employee stakeholders that this is not in line with our values and we expect more of you. And then the firm does make some statements, and then there's been aftermath and litigation as a result. But that is an example of a bunch of employee stakeholders really pushing the firm to engage in certain activities. We've seen this with Amazon. We've seen this with we've seen employee stakeholders really push their employers on multiple occasions. And you really see it when the employer doesn't seem to be acting in alignment with what the employees perceive as the values of the firm. And so that it would be an example. In terms of some takeaways, my first takeaway would be that we should not read the affirmative action decisions expansively. We should read them for what they say. These are university admissions cases. They are not organizational hiring cases. And so I very much, if the Supreme Court wants to overturn organizational hiring practices, then they need to get that case. So I think it's really important not to stifle your efforts prematurely based off of what you think the court is going to do one day. We should read the case for what it says and for the limitations that the court has put there. Now, that does not mean that I don't think that you should act proactively. Like, we're already seeing a lot of organizations move from using the word diversity and then adopting the experiences language that Roberts has put in his opinion. If you feel more comfortable, fine, in changing your policies in that way. But I think it's really important don't take the case a place where the case didn't say it was, because then you are stifling yourself prematurely. In terms of other things, I will just note that I would bet that a really deeply rooted anti-racist might be a little uncomfortable with some of the conversations we've had today. And I think that it's important to understand that there's room for both those in the DEI space and those in the anti-racist space. I think you come at these problems from different arguments and angles. And if we're all working together to push the organizations in particular places, that hopefully we end up with organizations that have better racial equity, that are more inclusive, that are better able to understand the values of all of their stakeholders, and then to incorporate that into practices that are good for shareholders. And so I'll end there.
Great, Dawn. We've given you a whole 2 minutes.
I know. I'll talk fast. Yeah, so
takeaway.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So definitely, I agree with what the two panelists had to say, Damien and Veronica, about the stakeholders. And, I can speak from an employee stakeholder standpoint as far as working for organizations where the employees have taken a very hard stance, specifically on, companies that we're working with in the energy sector. And there's very polarizing opinions about that. I have my own, but at the end of the day, we do come down on what's good for business and being able to do it in an ethical and a legal and in a way that is in line with our cultural and company values, right? And so that's very important. And I think that the conversation and how an organization has that conversation is really important, making sure that you're hearing from all the stakeholders, and then also empowering different voices, empowering diverse voices without passing judgment, but listening to what they have to say, and having those kind of different thinkers, and then doing the research. And I think one of the things that really struck me about what Veronica said is that a lot of times we hear something, but that's not what it actually says. And so it's really important that we're functioning from a perspective of true and real information, and making sure that we have the people in the room that can articulate what the actual thing is that we're debating about, as opposed to, I thought this, or I read this article and therefore I'm a Google expert, right? Making sure that we have the actual experts in the room that can do that. And I think what I'll leave you with is around what I work on so much as far as the purpose in my career around energy equity, and being able to infuse these equity infused approach into the energy system. And then also how, again, we reimagine what's already there, because that's the point that we're in. I think Damien mentioned that we're at the precipice of massive change. And I think that we all know that, we all feel that, but it's not change for change's sakes. The company I work for now has been around for 175 years. The last several companies I've worked for have been around for over 100 years. And they have systems and in place that need to be reimagined. And that is the job of every person in an organization, every person that those organizations touch. No matter what it is that you do or what you think your skill sets are or aren't, we all have a role to play. And I think that that's the way that we're going to actually see tangible change in a direction that's inclusive and helpful for everyone, is if we're all involved. Because it's not just my job, it's not just Veronica or Damien's job, it is all of our jobs. And so I think that it's not just pointing the fingers and telling someone else, go do it right, it's you doing it right and taking that personal accountability. And then that is what else that has the ripple effects in the corporate space.
Thank you, Dawn. That's great. And thank you to all our panelists. We've come to an all too quick end to this panel. I thank you for your thoughts and your honesty and your directness.